Okay, in this video, we're going to talk about macro lesson 5.4, the debt and deficits. And I want to go through a few definitions very quickly before we get into how deficits can affect the debt and then how deficits can also affect interest rates and the economy going forward. Real quick, the budget deficit is going to be the amount by which government expenditures exceed tax revenues. And this is something that we have in the United States right now, where the amount of money that we are spending is greater than the amount of money that we're bringing in tax revenue or in other revenue. And so we have this debt. Currently, the size of our deficit is in the neighborhood of $1.38 trillion. So what the government needs to do is the government's going to need to come up with the money in order to pay for all the things that it has agreed to pay for, or by law it must pay for. And so what the government will do is they will issue brand new bonds. So in the United States, it's the Treasury Department that does this. They're going to issue brand new bonds. And I want to emphasize the fact that these are new. These are not the bonds that the Federal Reserve or a central bank is buying and selling in order to affect the supply of money in the economy. These are going to be brand new bonds. So they are borrowing money in order to pay for this debt. To pay for this, I'll say. And this debt is going to be in the Treasury Department. There can, at times, be budget surpluses, and that's going to be the amount by which tax revenue exceeds government expenditures. And so I'll have our taxes will be greater than our government spending. The last one that we had here was in 2001, was our last surplus. There's been 5 of them over the last 50 years. I'll say last surplus. And when we have an accumulation of deficits, unlike surpluses, but when we have an accumulation of deficits, our national debt will grow. And so that's going to be the definition of our national debt. You might also see it as our public debt, accumulation of our government's deficit. So if our deficits continue over time, we will have a growing national debt. Currently, our national debt is $31.6 trillion. And it's growing every second. So what I'll do is I'm going to say it's roughly $31.6 trillion. In my notes from last year, the national debt was $30.3 trillion. So it's gone up by over $1 trillion just in the last 12 months. Sometimes you can see a situation where the Federal Reserve or the central bank purchases bonds, these brand new bonds, directly from the Treasury Department or directly from a government. And this is known as monetizing the debt. Let me fix this. And it can be highly inflationary. So this is not something that they're going to want to do regularly, with having the central bank buy up debt from the government. This has all been with regard to our federal government. We have with our budget deficit, budget surpluses, and the debt. This is for the United States federal government. There are times when by law or under political pressure, some governments, especially state and local governments, can have balanced budgets. And a balanced budget is going to be when our government expenditures equal our tax revenue. So this is going to happen annually. So each year, government expenditures must equal tax revenue. So in this case, if it's an annually balanced budget, what we'll have is we'll have a situation where the government spending equals the tax revenue, where those are going to be the same. Those can be tricky, especially in times of recessions or times of inflation, where under let's say under a recession, you can have a situation where there might be some automatic stabilizers that will put the government into a budget deficit. But in order to have a balanced budget, they would need to pursue contractionary policy to balance the budget, but that can make a recession worse. So this one is tricky. It's not always the most helpful thing to stabilize the economy. Another type of balanced budget you can have is a cyclically balanced budget. And that's going to be when the government passes a counter-cyclical policy. So it'll pursue expansionary policy during the recession and then contractionary policy during periods of inflation. However, this this is also problematic because recessions and periods of inflation might be different durations and different intensities and require uh, unequal measures to stabilize the economy. So this one doesn't always balance itself out at the end of one full business cycle. And just a reminder, after one full business cycle, it's not always going to be the same. So this one can be tricky as well. The second thing that I want to show you is just some of the effects of a fiscal policy in order to balance the budget. And so if we have expansionary fiscal policy, we could have a situation where we could increase government spending or decrease taxes. That is going to lead to a budget deficit if our government spending is greater than our tax revenue. That will increase our debt. And what will happen is if we have the situation, and I have it right up here, the government is going to need to issue brand new bonds. So the government's going to need to borrow money in order to do this. And when the government borrows money, there's going to be an increase in demand for loanable funds. Another way that you can think of this is it could be a situation where the government borrows the money and takes all the money out, then there's going to be a decrease in savings. So they're public savings. So you could make an argument that there'd be a decrease in supply of loanable funds when the government borrows this money in the form of selling bonds. Either way, you know this from the loanable funds market, that's going to lead to an increase in interest rates. Conversely, with contractionary fiscal policy, government would cut spending and it would increase taxes or increase taxes. That leads to a budget surplus, and a budget surplus would reduce the debt. And if the government does not need to borrow some of this money, the demand for loanable funds will go down. And if the government has a surplus, it could save some of that money. It could return some of that money to taxpayers, which would increase national savings. And if the demand falls or supply of loanable funds goes up, both of those will reduce the real interest rate. What I want to do now is show you some information from the Treasury Department's website on their revenue, their government spending, and the deficit. And so what I have here is some information on the deficit. And the deficit is going to occur when the money going out exceeds the money coming in, which is pretty simple in this case. Government spending is going to exceed tax revenue. As I said earlier, last 50 years, the government has run a surplus 5 times. The most recent one's in 2001. And this is the part that is important. When the government does run a deficit, the government's going to borrow money in the form of selling U.S. Treasury bonds. And for our class, bonds are going to be an overarching term, but officially it's bonds, bills, and other Treasury securities. We can have a surplus when there's going to be more revenue being brought in than there is going to be in government spending. We can have a balanced budget where government spending is going to equal the tax revenue. And finally, we can't have a deficit where there's going to be more spending than revenue, which is, again, is what we've got right now. And here's a graphic for fiscal year 2022, where we have $6.27 trillion in government spending, but we're only bringing in $4.9 trillion in revenue. And so that remaining part in that orange, that 1.38-ish trillion dollars is going to be the size of our annual deficit. And so the government's going to need to borrow that amount of money in order to cover all of its bills. And speaking of the spending and the revenue, I'm just going to back up and show you some information on government spending. And government spending is going to be on a variety of goods. And I can show you some of this right now if I scroll down. The government spends most of its money on Social Security, healthcare benefits, and then 12% of it's going to be on national defense, the same as Medicare, which is going to be, again, health benefits. Some education, some on paying old bonds. That's what net interest is. There's some on transportation, veterans benefits, and a host of other things. And I thought this was interesting as well. If I go to the government agency, Department of Health and Human Services gets most of the federal budget, as well as Social Security. And then there's a few other things. Treasury, military, again, 12%. Education, 10%, all the way down to Department of Homeland Security at 1%. And finally, the government collects revenue to finance all of its spending by mainly collecting taxes. So the primary source of revenue for the U.S. government is going to be individual taxes as well as corporate taxes, taxes to fund Social Security and Medicare. There are a few other things the government can do to collect revenue, admissions into national parks or other Other parks under the Interior Department, for example, is a smaller one. There's licensing and registration fees as well. But the most revenue, again, it's going to come from taxes. And so here's an interesting graphic on individual income taxes compared to corporate income taxes, gift taxes, Social Security taxes as well. So the total revenue under this is going to be almost $900 billion. And the last thing I wanted to show you is just some trends over time in taxes and where the taxes come from. So again, most of the taxes are going to come from individual income taxes, as you can see right here. Finally, just going to show you some information on the national debt, which is growing every minute. $31.459 trillion right now. And again, this is going to be an accumulation of all of our deficits over time.